Okay, our discussion about the main studio rule. What did this rule mean for radio stations? Well, I think this rule means for radio stations, number one, they don't have to have a brick and mortar building in every place that they want to broadcast from or where they want to have their stations to service. They don't necessarily have to have a brick and mortar building there. They'll also be able to save some funds. They don't have to spend a whole bunch of money because there won't be such a high cost of compliance with that main studio rule. And then it says, what are positives and negatives? Well, like I was saying, some of the positives are, the radio stations won't have to have a high cost of compliance. But also small towns and rural areas could potentially gain more service, because they can get service, they can get service, but the radio stations don't have to spend the same amount of money that it would normally cost to broadcast from a rural area because they don't have to have that main antenna there. Then, still those rural areas can get more service. Also, broadcasters, they can focus more of its resources and their funds on more local programming. They can make sure that they have good talent and that they're putting out good shows for the folks. They can also make sure that they can do more community outreach. A lot of those resources can be used for more community outreach, and they can keep up with more state-of-the-art equipment. They have the opportunity to make sure that they have the latest technologies out because they're not spending that extra money on having an antenna or a brick and mortar shop right there in every single market that they may want to broadcast from. And I think, because of this will help serve the public a little bit better. A lot of times people, when it comes to spending money, no corporation wants to spend a whole bunch of money. In this case, they won't have to spend a whole bunch of money, which I think will in turn serve the public better. And then I also believe that smaller radio stations will have an opportunity to compete a little bit better in the media market. Because, they, like I said, they don't have to have that big outlay of capital. Now there are some negatives though to the studio rule. Some of the negatives are, of course, there will not be a physical presence of broadcasting in some of those markets, some of those rural areas. There will not be an actual physical radio station there. I think there will be more studio jobs that will be eliminated because you won't have a physical presence there. So that takes the job creation, down instead of up. And then, something that, I think Rosenworld was saying in her report, there is, when there's no radio presence, then this can cause a serious service disconnect, especially when you're talking about natural disasters. And she gave the example in her brief, about the train, that was carrying the chemicals, and because it crashed and the chemicals went airborne, and there was no radio station there to really broadcast and let the folks in that community know that there was an issue and that they needed to be aware of. So that is definitely bad. Also, the same thing with the latest hurricane over in Houston, Texas. There were some radio stations there that were not broadcasting, and there was no coverage out in some of the areas that were really getting hit by that storm. So things like that, not having a physical presence, will definitely be a huge negative of the main studio rule. And it says, do you support the report and order, or do you think, or are you more on the dissenting side? I hate having to choose one side or the other because to me, there's never a right or wrong necessarily. There's points of views. If I had to choose a side, I'd probably support the main studio rule. But at the same time, I think maybe there should be compromises in the middle. I think, if radio stations didn't have to be in a certain area as far as brick and mortar, can you just have something remote going on where you have a reporter or a representative in that area? So when natural disasters do happen, there is some type of coverage, although there may not be a brick and mortar studio, or there may not be, just large building. But if there is someone working remote, whether that remote be at home or sharing an office space somewhere that keeps costs minimal, I'm thinking if there could be just a compromise. I don't want to dissent and say no, because I do feel like, and I also feel like, I don't want to see the larger radio stations gobbling up the bigger radio stations because of the main rule order either. I think, there ought to be some things in place where smaller radio stations are allowed a certain cap of the market size, and the FCC sees it at. And, I think it just ought to be more of a fair playing space there. So, I can't necessarily say I dissent to it. But like I said, if I had to take a stance, I would have to stay for the main studio rule. But anyway, maybe there can always be a compromise. That's always a good thing. Video Journal number 5. Thank you for listening.